It began, as such stories often do, on a morning thick with London fog, the kind that clings to one's coat and blurs the line between shadow and substance. I had barely poured the second cup of tea when Mrs. Hudson tapped at our door, her voice oddly subdued. "There's a gentleman here to see you, Mr. Holmes. Says it's urgent. Barrister." By the look of him, pale as a ghost, Holmes set down his violin without a word. Moments later, a man stepped into our sitting room, tall, elegant, but visibly shaken. His hair was disheveled, his cravat loosely knotted, and his eyes carried the panic of someone standing on the precipice of ruin. "I am Clive Redgrave," he said without preamble, "a barrister of the Inner Temple. I'm afraid I require your immediate assistance, Mr. Holmes. A man has been murdered in my chambers." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Redgrave." Redgrave's hands trembled as he removed his gloves. "This morning I arrived early, around 6:30. I had a case file to review before court. I unlocked the outer door to my chambers, stepped inside and found a man dead on my floor, shot through the chest. No signs of forced entry, no weapon, no footprints or fingerprints, nothing, just the corpse and this." He drew a folded sheet from his coat. Holmes took it and examined it closely. It was a page torn from a legal transcript cross-examination notes, annotated into different handwritings. One seemed methodical, neat, the other erratic, almost angry. The dialogue showed a barrister badgering a witness, then responding, as if he were the one under questioning. Holmes' eyes flicked to the final line. "Q. Did you kill him?" "Ah, I had no choice." "Fascinating," murmured Holmes. "And you're quite certain the victim is unknown to you?" Redgrave shook his head. "That's the strangest part. I've never seen him before. No identification, no name, just that page beside him." I interjected, "And no sign of a weapon, none." The constables turned the place over. It's as if the bullet materialized from thin air. Holmes stood, his eyes gleaming. "We must visit the chambers at once." It was a brisk walk to the Inner Temple. The fog had only thickened, lending an eerie stillness to the quiet court where Redgrave's chambers lay. A uniformed officer met us at the door. "Inspector Lestrade's already inside," he informed us. "Bit of a mess, this one." The room was a study in order bookshelves neatly arranged, a desk meticulously kept. Yet at the center of the carpet lay the body of a man in his 50s, graying hair, expensive suit, a gold ring still on his finger. A pool of blood had dried beneath him. There was no splatter on the surrounding walls, as if the shot had come straight down from above. "Entry wound clean," Lestrade said without looking up. "Single bullet to the heart. No weapon. No ID. Door locked from the inside. Windows bolted. We had to break the lock to get in." "Bullet recovered?" Holmes asked. "Odd thing, that." Lestrade replied. "No bullet found. Went clean through, it seems. But there's no exit wound, not even embedded in the floor. Our forensics man is stumped." Holmes crouched beside the body, glancing at the nearby page. "Have you noticed the handwriting?" "I have. To sets. We're trying to match them now. Holmes nodded, then stepped back and examined the windows, the door, the surrounding shelves. Mr. Redgrave, are all your chambers occupied this early? No. My neighbouring tenants rarely arrive before 9, and this room was locked when I left last night. Holmes's gaze fixed on the desk. He walked over, examined the blotter, and ran a finger along a faint indentation. Redgrave, do you keep a revolver? Certainly not. No hidden compartments in the desk. None I'm aware of. Holmes turned to the shelves. This collection legal case files, past, arguments, precedents I reference often. He pulled out one thick volume and opened it. Inside was not case law, but a hollowed compartment empty. Holmes held it up silently. I've never seen that before, Redgrave gasped. Yet the dust around it suggests it was removed recently, perhaps last night. A low whistle escaped Lestrade's lips. So we had a weapon hidden there, or something else, Holmes said. The transcript is too carefully placed to be accidental. This murder was staged to resemble something, perhaps. A legal metaphor. A man interrogating himself. A barrister gone mad. But to what end? I asked. Holmes picked up the transcript again. This line. Did you kill him? I had no choice. Sounds like a confession. But whose? At that moment, Lestrade's man entered with a small envelope, found behind a bookcase. Inspector. Must have been shoved there in a hurry. Lestrade opened it. Inside were two items: a calling card bearing the name Dominic Henshaw, QC, and a key. Holmes took the card. Henshaw, a barrister? Yes. Redgrave paled. Yes, a senior prosecutor. Retired 2 years ago. Ruthless in court. I've met him only twice. He argued a case that he trailed off. Holmes waited. He ruined a colleague of mine, Peter Morland, accused of falsifying testimony. The man was innocent, but Henshaw's questioning destroyed him. Morland was disbarred. Took his own life months later. Do you recall what evidence sealed it? A manipulated transcript. Someone switched the court notes. Holmes nodded slowly. And who had access to those notes? Redgrave's expression changed. I did. I was young, foolish. I passed the draft to the wrong clerk, thinking nothing of it. The wrong version reached the bench. Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes said, so Henshaw dies, found beside a page of cross-examination, resembling your own work, in your office, with no one else present, and you claim no involvement? I swear it. I didn't even know he was there. Holmes was already examining the back of the calling card under the gaslight. Faint pencil marks a time and date. 6:30 a.m., July 6th, your final hearing. Holmes handed it to Lestrade. I suspect, he said, Henshaw arranged a confrontation here, possibly planning to accuse Redgrave face-to-face, perhaps to avenge Morland. But something changed. Lestrade frowned. But why write a transcript like that? Holmes folded the page. Because he wanted it to look like Redgrave interrogated himself. A legal suicide note, if you will. You think Henshaw killed himself? No, Holmes said sharply. He was murdered. But by whom and why is what we must determine next. The key found with the card, where does it lead? Redgrave. Examined it. It's not to my chambers. I don't recognize it. Then we find what it opens. Holmes said, quickly, because someone staged this scene with intent. And I dare say, Mr. Redgrave, they wanted the law to turn on its own. Holmes turned the key over in his gloved fingers, eyes narrowing as he examined the notches. This is no standard door key, he said quietly, almost to himself. Two, short, notched irregularly, likely to a drawer or a private lockbox. He slid it into his pocket without another word and returned to the hollowed law book. The chambers had settled into an uncomfortable silence, the dead man's presence still oppressive. Redgrave stood stiffly near the window, glancing between US and the door as though expecting it to burst open with a constable ready to drag him away. Holmes approached him once more, this time gently. You say you arrived at 6:30 this morning. Yes. Is that your usual hour? Not at all. I generally arrive by 8, but I needed to prepare cross-references for a hearing. I couldn't sleep, so I came early. Holmes studied him for a beat longer, then turned abruptly and moved to the coat stand by the door. He brushed past the outermost coat, revealing a second behind it. It was older, darker, with a frayed cuff and traces of dried mud along the hem. This isn't yours. Redgrave stared at it. No, I've never seen that before. Lestrade stepped in. Could be the victim's. Holmes reached into the coat's inner pocket and drew out a folded handkerchief. A small monogram adorned the corner. D.H. Dominic Henshaw's. Holmes murmured. He must have arrived before Redgrave. Let himself in. But how? I asked. The outer door was locked when Redgrave arrived. Holmes turned, eyes alight. Indeed. Which suggests Henshaw had his own key or someone let him in earlier, and then locked the door behind him. He turned back to the coat and withdrew a receipt from another pocket. 1 bottle of Glenlick single malt, purchased last night at 10:43 p.m. corner of Chancery Lane. So he was in the area late. But why come here? Lestrade was already muttering to his sergeant to canvass the area for witnesses or shopkeepers. Who might have seen Henshaw last night? Holmes, meanwhile, circled back to the desk and lifted a small bronze statue that had been perched on the corner. An owl with outstretched wings. He turned it over, waited, quite solid. He remarked, but recently moved. See here. He pointed to a clean outline beneath the base where dust had settled elsewhere. Someone picked this up during the night, possibly held it, or considered using it. I watched Redgrave closely then. He hadn't moved since Holmes discovered the coat. But now, as Holmes replaced the statue, I noticed a slight twitching. His left hand fingers curling toward his palm, then relaxing again, repeated once, then again. Holmes noticed, too, "You're nervous, Mr. Redgrave." "Won't you be?" Redgrave replied, trying for composure but missing the mark. "A man found dead in my chambers. I could hang for this. You're not afraid of guilt?" Holmes said softly, "You're afraid of exposure. Something about this scene strikes a chord." "What is it?" Redgrave opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw tightened. "I believe," Holmes continued, stepping closer, that this isn't the first time you've seen a cross-examination transcript like this. Redgrave's silence deepened. Holmes moved past him and picked up the discarded transcript again. This line, "I had no choice," is phrased almost like an echo, as if it were said before. Was this phrase familiar to you? Yes. Redgrave whispered. Peter Morland said it, the night before he died. I visited him. He was drinking, ranting about Henshaw. Said he never meant for it to go so far. I had no choice, he kept repeating. Holmes nodded, so Henshaw included that line deliberately, to invoke Morland. This scene wasn't just staged, it was dramatized. Lestrade, looking grim, muttered, "That's no suicide. That's a message." Holmes turned to the bookshelves again. We're missing something. There's too much precision here. The coat, the page, the key. This is not random. It's a puzzle laid by someone who understands theatricality, possibly law, possibly performance. Then his eyes settled on something. Above the bookshelf, a small black object half concealed by a decorative plaster bust. He climbed the step stool, retrieved it, and brought it down. A fountain pen, he said, holding it up, cracked near the tip. Ink still wet. Redgrave squinted. That's not mine. Holmes unscrewed the barrel and pulled free a tightly rolled piece of paper. What's this? Lestrade asked, stepping closer. Holmes unrolled it carefully. A list. Look. Names. 5 of them. He read them aloud. Peter Morland, Arthur Bellamy, D. Henshaw, Regina Crowe, R. Redgrave. Redgrave stepped forward. That's my name, and Morland's, Henshaw's. But who are the others? Holmes scanned the list. Regina Crowe, isn't she a stenographer at the Old Bailey? Yes, Lestrade confirmed. Sharp. Been there years. And Bellamy? Clerk to the court. Died last year, carriage accident. Holmes nodded. So we have a list of 5 people connected to a single case or event, all linked to a courtroom. 3 are dead or disgraced. 1 is Redgrave. 1 remains Regina Crowe. He pocketed the list, then looked to Lestrade. We must speak to Miss Crowe at once. Quietly, if this is a warning, she may be in danger. Lestrade gave swift orders and exited with his sergeant. I turned to Holmes. So Henshaw was part of some buried scandal. More than that, Holmes said. This is vengeance meticulously executed. Someone is reconstructing the pieces of a long-forgotten miscarriage of justice. But who and why now? At that moment, a knock sounded at the outer door. Holmes tensed, then crossed to open it. A boy in messenger livery stood holding a small, brown-wrapped parcel. For Mr. Redgrave, the boy said, handing it over. No. Return address. Said it was urgent. Holmes took it. Who gave it to you? Bloke in a dark coat. Face covered. Holmes closed the door and unwrapped the parcel on the desk. Inside was a small wooden box. When he opened it, we saw a single object resting on black velvet. A silver barrister's wig pin-bloodied. The silence that followed was thick as molasses. Holmes lifted the pin gently, turning it in the light. This, he said, is no message. It's a challenge. Someone has set the stage, Mr. Redgrave, and now they're inviting us to play our parts." Holmes slipped the bloodied wig pin back into its box and closed the lid with a snap. His gaze lingered for a moment on the velvet lining, as though expecting it to whisper a confession. Then he turned to Redgrave. "We will speak to Regina Crowe now. You will remain here, under Lestrade's guard. I want no sudden absences or attempts to tidy loose ends." Redgrave swallowed but nodded, his skin the color of chalk. "I have nowhere to run." Outside, the fog had thinned slightly, a weak sun pressing through the mist like a lantern behind frosted glass. We hailed a cab and made for the Old Bailey, where Holmes's name alone eased our passage past guards and clerks. Miss Regina Crowe was located in a cramped record room, hunched over a stack of ledgers like a figure from a Dutch painting's sharp features. Grey-streaked hair pinned severely, hands precise and swift. "Miss Crowe," Holmes said politely. "A word, if we may." She looked up, startled at first, then composed. "Mr. Holmes, of course. I heard about Mr. Henshaw. Dreadful business." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "You've heard already." She gave a small smile. "Clerks chatter. They say he was found dead in a barrister's chambers, Mr. Redgrave's. You know Mr. Redgrave? I've transcribed several of his cases. A capable man, if a little self-satisfied." "Why?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "Tell me, Miss Crowe, what do you recall of the trial of Peter Morland?" Her posture stiffened, fingers pausing mid-page. "That was years ago. Do you remember what happened?" "I remember a promising young advocate being accused of tampering with witness statements. The scandal ruined him. It was tragic. Do you recall the final transcript? The version read into the record." She paused, eyes narrowing. "There was confusion. The draft I typed didn't match what the judge quoted. At the time, I thought I had made an error." "You didn't." She looked up sharply. "The version entered into evidence had been altered, a subtle shift of phrasing, enough to imply Morland coerced testimony, enough to destroy him." Miss Crowe's eyes clouded. "I always suspected something was wrong, but no one wanted to hear it. Henshaw was persuasive, relentless, and Redgrave? He passed the drafts between us, but I don't believe he read them closely. He was young, ambitious, easily distracted. Still, he was the only one with access to both the original and final versions." She nodded slowly. "You believe someone's punishing those responsible. I believe someone's staging an elaborate reckoning. And your name is on a list found hidden in Henshaw's possession." She went pale. "What kind of list?" "A list of 5 names, for connected to Morland's trial. 1 deceased in an accident, 1 murdered this morning. That leaves you and Redgrave." She stared at the desk for a long moment. "Do you think I'm next?" "I think you've just moved to the center of someone's game." "Did Henshaw contact you recently?" "No. No. Letters, messages, anonymous parcels." She hesitated. "Now that you mention it, I received a note 3 days ago. No signature, just a quote, typed. I thought it was a mistake." Holmes leaned forward. "Do you have it?" She reached beneath a blotter and handed him a slip of paper. He read it aloud, when the advocate becomes the accused, who shall speak in his defense? Typed. Holmes murmured, "No markings, no smudges. Whoever sent this wanted you to wonder, but not act." Crow's voice dropped. "Why now? Morland died years ago, because revenge ages in silence. And whoever is behind this, they've been planning carefully." We left the record room in silence, Crow's anxious eyes following us to the corridor. Outside, Holmes tapped his walking stick on the steps, lost in thought. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "Motives are aligning, Watson, but not comfortably. Someone wants us to believe Henshaw was the architect of his own demise's suicide wrapped in symbolism. But it was too clean, too deliberate. He was lured, played, and killed." Back at Redgrave's chambers, Lestrade met us at the door, looking irritated. "Your man hasn't moved an inch, but we've found something curious." He led us to the adjoining chamber belonging to another barrister, currently away on business. Inside, a faint crack had been revealed behind a bookshelf leading to a narrow passage, barely wide enough to walk through. Old servant corridor, we think, runs along the back of Redgrave's wall. We followed it, stooping. Midway down, Holmes stopped abruptly and pointed. A thin wire ran through the brickwork, strung taut. "Trigger wire," he said. "Too thin to notice in haste. Connected to something." We followed it to a box concealed behind a panel. Inside, an ancient mechanism fitted with a striker and a spent cartridge. "A trap," Holmes said softly. "A mechanical device to fire a bullet into the chamber from the adjoining room." Henshaw didn't walk into a murder, he walked into a performance. One in which the killer pulled the trigger. From the shadows. "Who?" Lestrade asked. "Redgrave." Holmes shook his head. "To elaborate for impulse. This was designed." And Redgrave looked genuinely rattled. Then he turned suddenly to me. "Watson, do you recall the pen I found? The cracked one?" "Yes." "Bring it." I fetched it from the desk. Holmes opened it again and examined the barrel under a magnifying glass. Then he pried the ink reservoir loose, and behind it, pressed deep into the narrow chamber, was a second sliver of paper dot. He teased it out. This one bore only a single phrase, scrawled in a jagged, angry hand. "She knew." "She," Holmes repeated. "Crow," Lestrade said. "So she was involved after all. Or the killer wants us to believe she was. There are too many deliberate hints, each one a whisper in a different direction." Redgrave, watching us with wide eyes, finally spoke. "There's someone you haven't spoken to. The last person to see Morland alive." "Who?" Holmes asked. Redgrave hesitated. "Annabel Morland. His sister." "And where is she now?" "She left London after his death, joined a private firm in the north, changed her surname. But I've kept in touch. Letters, once or twice." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Find her address. Now. Whoever is behind this hasn't finished. And if I'm correct, she may hold the key to the entire deception." Redgrave's trembling fingers leafed through a battered address book until he found the name Annabel Mercer. He slid it across the desk without a word. Holmes read the address aloud in a low murmur. "Whitby, coastal, remote, convenient for vanishing." Lestrade dispatched a telegram for local constables to keep quiet watch. While Holmes stared at the note from the pen again, she knew. His thumb traced the edges thoughtfully. "The killer is clever," he said. "They leave clues crafted to provoke suspicion. First Henshaw's list, then this accusation tucked into a pen. It feels like each message is scripted to implicate the next person, a chain reaction. But each link is off-kilter." I stepped beside him. "If they're framing people, why not just kill Redgrave directly? Because death isn't the only goal. Exposure is. Humiliation. Collapse." He turned back to Redgrave. "Tell me about your connection to Annabel Mercer." Redgrave shifted uncomfortably. "We were close. Briefly, after her brother's death. She was fragile, isolated. I tried to support her." Holmes's brow twitched. "You had a relationship, Yes, but it ended poorly. She said she couldn't trust me. After Morland's suicide, she changed." Holmes moved to the window. "She had reason. Her brother was disgraced and destroyed in the courts, abandoned by colleagues. You were one of them." Redgrave flared. "I didn't forge the transcript. No, but you let it pass. And someone, perhaps Annabel, hasn't forgotten." Lestrade returned, reading from a fresh report. "The constables in Whitby confirm a Miss Mercer's residence. She left 3 days ago heading for London. Alone. By train." Holmes's eyes flicked up. 3 days ago, just before the murder. She's already here. Now the web was tightening. 5 names on a list. 4 of them now either dead, accused, or under suspicion. The final was Annabel Mercer, who may have orchestrated the whole thing. But motive alone wasn't enough. Holmes ordered Regina Crowe brought to Redgrave's chambers. She arrived flustered, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. "You said I was safe," she whispered. "You may still be," Holmes said, "but only if you tell us everything." She hesitated. Then her shoulders sagged. "After Morland died, I went through his final case notes. I found the inconsistencies. I confronted Henshaw. He denied everything but asked me not to dig deeper." "Did you tell Annabel?" "Yes. She reached out months later. Said she wanted justice. I gave her what I had. Drafts, notes, letters. I thought that was the end of it." Holmes nodded slowly, and then she began to build her case, not in court, in shadows. Redgrave stood abruptly, pale. "But this doesn't make sense. If she's behind it all, why kill Henshaw now?" Holmes was already pacing. "Because she feared he might confess, or perhaps he refused to play the role she wrote for him." Lestrade interjected. "There's more. We tracked the paper used in the pen message. Same type as a batch purchased at a stationer in Soho 2 weeks ago. Paid in cash. Buyer was a woman. Brunette, thin, northern accent. That fits," Holmes said. "Annabel's scripting each piece. But something troubles me." He turned back to the receipt from Henshaw's coat, the bottle of Glenlick purchased at 10:43 p.m. Too late for a social visit, but early enough to plan something sinister. What if he met Annabel that night? What if he tried to walk away? Then she silenced him, I offered, or someone else did. Holmes countered, someone else using her plan. That's the snag. The method of death trap mechanism, performance, symbolism feels theatrical, but also mechanical, precise. That suggests more than vengeance. It suggests pride. Regina spoke again. There was someone else, Morland's protege, quiet, awkward boy, obsessed with details, always in the background. What was his name? Lawrence Vexley. He was never officially part of the team, but he followed Morland everywhere, worshipped him. Lestrade flipped through his notes. No mention of him in the court records. He was an intern, Redgrave said. Didn't last long. Dropped out of law entirely. Holmes's eyes lit up. Someone forgotten. Who remembers everything? He wouldn't be on the list, but he'd know the truth. And if he felt the system failed his mentor, he'd finish what Morland started, I said. Holmes was already moving. Find Vexley, pull every academic and legal directory from the last decade. Look for any mention. We're not hunting one motive, we're hunting several. Grief, love, betrayal, guilt. He stopped abruptly and looked to Redgrave. When did you last speak to Annabel? Months ago to letter. She said she'd found purpose, that she finally saw the balance tipping. I thought she meant moving on. Watson, Holmes said. The letter you retrieved earlier, does it mention a date? I checked. Yes. Typed. Dated 3 days before Henshaw's death. 3 days. Holmes repeated. She returns to London. Henshaw is murdered. But she sends a letter in advance. Lestrade frowned. Which means someone else delivered the blow. Holmes nodded. Annabel may be the architect, but Vexley may be her instrument, or perhaps her master. A knock at the chamber door broke the tension. A constable entered, holding a file from the university archive. He said, Lawrence Vexley, studied law under Peter Morland, dropped out 2 months after Morland's death. No fixed address. But he turned the page. Currently, writing under a pseudonym V. Cantrell. Legal essays, published privately, based in Bloomsbury. Holmes took the paper. Cantrell. I've read his work. Brilliant. Cold. Unsettling. The tone of a man disappointed by justice itself. Lestrade snapped to action. I'll send men to his lodgings. No, Holmes said quickly. Not yet. We need to draw him out. If he's behind this, he won't stop. He'll come for crow necks, unless we bait the hook. Regina paled. You want to use me? I want to protect you and catch a killer, as the plan formed. I saw it clearly, a web of interwoven motives, Annabel's pain, Redgrave's guilt, Henshaw's fear, Crow's complicity, and somewhere in the shadows, a ghost of the past Vexley, the forgotten disciple, building a final argument in blood. The trap was set with cold precision. Regina Crow was relocated quietly and under guard to a safe flat above a tea shop. In Clerkenwell, Holmes insisted on a modesty of arrangements. No uniformed police, no obvious surveillance, just a narrow lane, a discreet rear staircase, and a room with a view of both entrance and alley. Lestrade grumbled at the unconventionality, but deferred. Holmes was rarely wrong in matters of bait. By evening, a letter arrived. No stamp, no seal, just slipped beneath the door like a whisper. Regina handed it to Holmes with trembling hands. He unfolded it without a word. Justice sleeps no more. You knew. You let it happen. You will hear the verdict at midnight. Holmes didn't react immediately. He passed it to Lestrade, who swore under his breath. Same typewriter, Holmes said. Same phrasing. Same mind behind it. But the hour has moved. Midnight. They want her to fear the clock's toll. Lestrade read the note again. Shall we move her? Bring an armed watch? No, Holmes said. They won't come if they sense interference. We'll wait, and we'll be ready. But before midnight came, a new twist unraveled the threads they thought they were tightening. At 10:20 p.m., a young constable arrived breathless at Redgrave's chambers. Sir, he told Lestrade, we've picked up Lawrence Vexley, or someone using that name. He walked into a solicitor's office in Gray's Inn and confessed. Lestrade blinked. Confessed. The constable nodded. Said he was responsible for the death of Albert Henshaw. Said he tampered with the room. Planted the pin. Wrote the messages. Even produced a notebook describing the trap mechanism. Pages of it. Diagrams. Holmes stiffened. Did he say why? The constable consulted his notes. Said justice had been denied too long. That he was delivering a final summation on behalf of Peter Morland. He sounded calm. Precise. Lestrade stood. That's it, then. We've got him. Crow can rest easy now. Holmes didn't move. His gaze had gone glassy. Lestrade frowned. You disagree. I'm unconvinced, Holmes said softly. Something is misaligned. Redgrave, seated in the corner, looked up. He confessed. Isn't that enough? No, not when it comes to easily. Holmes stood and paced. A man who constructs a mechanical trap across the chambers. Who plans notes, symbols, messages, layered deceptions over years, does not simply stroll into a solicitor's office with diagrams in hand. It's too clean. He might be surrendering from guilt. I suggested, or Holmes said, turning sharply. He's a decoy. Lestrade blinked. You think someone's framing Vexley? I think Vexley may have been used, groomed, positioned, or perhaps. He trailed off. What? Holmes's voice dropped. Perhaps Vexley is a shadow, a name borrowed, a persona built from fragments. The real mind may be someone else entirely. At that moment, a knock interrupted the tension. Another constable. Telegram just came through. From Whitby. Lestrade opened it. Miss Mercer confirmed departed by train. However, neighbor reports she returned same evening. Disguised. Took second trunk. Destination unknown. Holmes turned to me. Watson, what did Redgrave say about Annabel's return to London? He believed she arrived 3 days ago. No, he said she left 3 days ago. But the letter she sent him is dated 3 days before the murder. That means it was written before she departed Whitby. I stared at him. She planned her movements in advance. Exactly. Which raises the question, where is Annabel Mercer now? Lestrade muttered. If Vexley's in custody, who's watching Regina Crow? Holmes was already at the door. We are. The dash to Clerkenwell was quick but suffocating. Rain had begun, light and biting. By the time we reached the alley, The street was silent. No carriages, no footfall. Holmes signalled Lestrade to hold back and approached the staircase alone, his steps soft against the whetstone. At the top, the rear window of the flat was ajar. Inside. The oil lamp still burned. Regina Crowe sat in the armchair, motionless, eyes wide, not in death, but in shock. Her hands trembled, clutching a folded sheet of paper. Holmes entered without a sound. Miss Crowe, she looked up, barely breathing. She was here. Holmes moved to her side. Annabel, she nodded. She stood right there, wearing a grey coat, a hat with netting. I didn't recognize her at first. She said only one thing. "What was it?" she said. "You're not the one I want, but you'll do if the others fail." Then she left. Holmes took the paper from her hands. The same paper, same typewriter. A new message. "The court is still in session. The prosecution rests when the truth is buried." Lestrade arrived moments later. Face like thunder. "Vexley's no killer. He's just a voice. Someone else is speaking through him." "Annabel," I said. Holmes shook his head. "Not entirely. She's a vessel, not the architect. She has passion, motive. But this," he held up the note, "this is the work of someone who plays with structure, who crafts performance, who rewrites endings." He turned to Crowe. "What did Annabel really want from you?" Regina blinked. She said she needed the original transcript, the first one, from Morland's trial. Holmes went cold. "You have it?" "I kept it, hidden, for years." "Where is it now?" "In my satchel. I didn't trust it at home." Holmes tore it open and unfolded the old, yellowing type. He compared it with the official copy retrieved from court archives. The final sentence had been changed. In the original, the witness had stated, "He warned me to speak the truth." In the altered version, "He warned me not to speak the truth." A single knot, inserted by a forger. The foundation of the entire conviction. She wanted this exposed. Holmes murmured. That was her endgame. The trial, the forgery, the fall of Morland. It all comes down to this sentence. "Then she wins," Lestrade said flatly. "She's proved the system corrupt." "No," Holmes replied, "because someone else is still killing. Henshaw's death was not to reveal truth, it was to control the narrative. Annabel may be trying to unveil the past, but the real killer is trying to silence it." Lestrade scowled. "So what now?" Holmes answered without hesitation. "We follow the play to its final act. Vexley is no more than a herald. Annabel is a ghost from the past. But the true mind behind this, whoever crafted the letters, the pin, the trap, has not finished. They've merely paused for applause." And he turned, with that unmistakable glint in his eye, toward the darkness yet to be revealed. Holmes sat by the dim firelight in our Baker Street lodgings. The original transcript spread out on the table before him. He had scarcely spoken since our return from Clerkenwell, save for one whispered observation. The knot changed everything. Outside, the gas lamps hissed in the fog, a faint echo of the turmoil curling through his mind. I knew better than to disturb him, yet after nearly an hour of silence, I ventured. "You believe the forgery of that transcript is the true motive?" He didn't lift his eyes. It's the root, but not the motive. I frowned. What do you mean? There is a difference between digging up a lie and killing to keep it buried. The forgery explains a miscarriage of justice, but the murder is a message. And to understand the message, we must learn who forged the lie in the first place. The name Peter Morland hung in the air between us, wrongfully convicted, driven to madness, and dead behind bars. Henshaw had prosecuted him. Crowe had shaped the witness testimony. Redgrave had presided over it all. Now one was dead, another threatened, and the third frightened into retreat. But one question remained unanswered. Who gained from Morland's ruin? Holmes stood abruptly and crossed to the bookshelf. Watson, the case from 1891, do you recall the Clenham Bank inquiry? I nodded. A scandal involving embezzlement and perjury. But it was dismissed for lack of evidence. He extracted a thin dossier and laid it beside the transcript. Yes, but more importantly, look at this. He tapped a marginal note in a dusty memorandum. Peter Morland was the junior accountant who flagged the irregularities. He tried to bring them forward in court, was nearly laughed out of the chambers. Months later, he was arrested in an unrelated fraud claim and prosecuted by Albert Henshaw. I finished. Exactly. The Clenham case was never unrelated. Morland tried to expose the bank's crimes, and for that, someone buried him with doctored transcripts and a very public disgrace. I leaned closer. So the forgery wasn't merely to convict a man, it was to protect someone with ties to the bank. Holmes nodded, a name that has eluded us until now. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, hat in hand, his face taut with unease. I just left the yard. Vexley's been released. Turns out his name isn't Lawrence Vexley at all, it's Charles Avery, a failed playwright who vanished from the London stage 10 years ago. He confessed to get attention. Holmes didn't look surprised, a puppet without strings. The real puppeteer remains in hiding. Lestrade handed over a sheet. We found this in his lodgings. An old theatre program he'd circled. One name: backstage crew, Thomas Broyle. Holmes took the program and stilled. Broyle. You know him? I asked. Only the way one knows a shadow that lingers too long. He pulled a ledger from beneath the desk. Thomas Broyle worked at the Clenham Bank. He was dismissed during the inquiry, but not charged. Too insignificant, they said. But he wasn't insignificant. He was a fixer, a cleaner, the sort of man you use when a matter needs to disappear quietly. Holmes laid the theatre program beside the transcript and pointed to the type. Watson, remember when I said the notes were all typed on the same machine? Yes, they weren't. I stared at him. 3 notes were typed with consistent pressure and spacing. But the fourth, the one left for Regina, was struck slightly harder. The E and R are faintly off-angle. He reached into a drawer and pulled a faded envelope. This arrived anonymously in 1894, after the Clenham case was buried. It was a warning addressed to the then Attorney General. It was ignored. But look at the typing. I leaned in. The same offset E, the same awkward slant to the R. It's Broyle, Holmes said, almost with reverence. He's been speaking for years. whispering through machines, warning and threatening by turns, and now killing. Lestrade's brow furrowed. But why now? What brought him back after all this time? Holmes's eyes glittered. Because someone has returned to the stage, someone he once helped or harmed. A silence passed. Annabel, I said. Holmes nodded. She wasn't just Morland's niece. She was also his ward after her parents died. Broyle would have known her, perhaps even taught her how to send messages, forge letters, stage a performance. She was a girl once impressionable, grieving, and now she's walking the same tightrope he once did. So they're connected. Their reflections, Holmes said. She seeks justice for her uncle. He seeks vengeance for his erasure. And between them stands the truth long hidden. Barely breathing, Lestrade swore, if Broyle's alive, he'll kill again. You think he's after Crow? Possibly, Holmes said. But more likely Redgrave. He's under guard. Holmes shook his head. Not well enough. We were out the door in moments, the fog pressing tighter with each step. When we arrived at Redgrave's house in Fitzrovia, the gas lamp on the porch flickered violently in the wind. The front door stood ajar. Lestrade was the first in, his revolver drawn. Holmes followed without pause. The sitting room was empty, the study dark, a glass of brandy untouched on the table. A sound came from upstairs. Holmes darted up, 2 steps at a time. I followed. In the master bedroom, a chair was overturned. A pair of shoes Redgrave's lay neatly beside the bed. But no Redgrave. What we found instead was a note pinned to the curtain. The verdict was always yours to fear. Consider this your recess. Holmes read it once, then again, and then turned to Lestrade. He's not going to kill Redgrave, he said quietly. Not yet. Then what? Holmes looked down at the shoes. He's going to put him on trial. And I felt a chill deeper than the night outside, for Holmes did not speak of a metaphor. He meant it literally. The past was not done screaming. It was rising, cloaked in fog, dragging justice behind it like a corpse. Holmes stood at the edge of Redgrave's bedroom, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the shoes by the bed. He left them behind deliberately. He murmured, not to Lestrade or to me, but to the room itself, as though the very shadows might answer him. Symbolism stripping the judge of his dignity. A gesture of trial by abduction. Lestrade bristled. We've got constables scouring every alley and warehouse. Within 2 miles. He can't have gone far. Holmes shook his head. Broyle doesn't flee. He prepares. He's waited years to stage this reckoning. He won't rush the performance now. What are you suggesting? That we provoke him? We returned to Baker Street that night, and I noticed Holmes had acquired something from Redgrave's house, a velvet-bound law book, worn at the spine. He leafed through it silently as we settled in. Finally, he turned to me with a sudden gleam in his eyes. Watson, I need you to write a letter. To whom? To the Times, under Redgrave's name. I blinked. A false letter, a strategic fiction. He replied, we'll announce Redgrave's intent to publicly address the Morland trial. Say he's had a crisis of conscience. that he will hold a private gathering in 1 day's time to explain his role in the miscarriage of justice. But Broyle knows Redgrave's been taken, and if he's watching as I believe he will feel compelled to act, to correct the narrative before it escapes his control. He has shaped this drama carefully. Watson, if we alter the script mid-act, he'll emerge to seize the stage once more. Lestrade was uneasy, but he relented. We'll have men on every rooftop. I'll arrange it the next evening. As the letter appeared in print, Holmes sent out personal invitations to Henshaw's former clerk, to Crowe, and two journalists who had covered the original Morland case. One by one, they gathered in a hired drawing-room off Fleet Street. Lured by the headline, Redgrave breaks silence. But there was no Redgrave, only Holmes, seated in a high-backed chair, a copy of a treatise on judicial ethics in his lap. They murmured among themselves, confused, until Holmes rose. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, "you've come to witness a confession, but not from Lord Redgrave." Crowe stepped forward. "Then who?" Holmes turned to a pale man at the edge of the group. Ernest Garvey, the former court stenographer. "You, Mr. Garvey, you, who took down every word of that trial and yet failed to raise a single protest when the transcript was falsified." Garvey flinched. I did no such thing." Holmes didn't press. Instead, he gestured toward the back of the room. "You've heard of Broyle, yes?" The man accused of forging the Morland transcript. Several nodded cautiously. "I have received a note," Holmes continued, producing a folded paper, "inviting me to participate in the next phase of his performance. He dares me to find Redgrave before his trial begins. Midnight tomorrow." Lestrade shifted behind the curtain, hidden from view. Holmes stepped closer to Garvey. "But I believe you know where he is." The man's eyes widened. Holmes held the silence for a long beat. Then, very calmly, he took a candlestick from the table and turned it upside down. A faint clink sounded, something rattling within. "Waited," Holmes murmured. Hollow. He extracted a rolled slip of paper and unfurled it. "Coordinates," he said. "Left for me by Broyle, or rather, planted here with the expectation I'd find it. But there's a flaw. Only one person knew I would choose this location to stage tonight's event." Garvey looked about to bolt. Lestrade stepped forward at last, revolver raised. But Holmes raised a hand. "No, Lestrade. Let him speak." Garvey stood frozen, sweat glistening on his brow. Holmes moved to the window and tapped the glass. "Broyle is watching us." He needed someone inside this gathering to observe our moves. Someone with ties to the past, but unassuming enough to escape suspicion. "You, Mr. Garvey, have served as his eyes and ears." Garvey's defiance cracked like thin ice. He said it wasn't about revenge. He whispered. He said it was justice. And in return, Holmes asked, he promised, protection. When the truth came out, Holmes turned to me. He manipulated Garvey just as he manipulated the evidence. Always one step removed. Lestrade arrested Garvey then, and Holmes watched in silence as he was taken out. As the room emptied, Holmes stood by the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Broyle has shown his hand," he said softly. "He knows we're closing in." Garvey's betrayal wasn't essential, it was psychological. Broyle wanted to see how far we'd go. He wanted to test whether we could turn on ourselves. And the coordinates? Holmes opened the paper again. They point to an abandoned courthouse in Hampstead. Symbolic, of course, the place where justice sleeps. And Redgrave, he'll be there, Holmes said, alive, for now. The wind howled outside. Holmes looked to the darkened sky as if listening for a cue, then nodded to himself. "This," he said, "is where the play ends, and the verdict begins." We arrived at the abandoned Hampstead courthouse shortly after dawn. The old structure loomed against the morning mist, its crumbling facade half swallowed by ivy and disuse. Lestrade had positioned constables at every approach, yet Holmes waved them off from the entrance, insisting this part be done with minimal noise. He stepped through the warped double doors without hesitation, the hollow echo of his footsteps ringing out through the skeletal remains of justice. The grand hall was a shrine to decay. Benches lay rotting, the judge's seat veiled in cobwebs. But at the center, positioned with deliberate theatricality, stood a single wooden chair. Lord Redgrave sat in it, wrists bound, mouth gagged, but alive. His eyes followed us sharply. As we entered, Lestrade moved to cut him free, but Holmes stopped him with a look. "No one touches anything yet." He examined the chair first, then the floor beneath. A trail of salt had been poured in a faint semicircle round Redgrave's feet. Holmes crouched, rubbed it between his fingers, and murmured, "Symbolic demarcation. A trial circle. He means for Redgrave to remain within-judged." Lestrade grumbled, "We've got him now. There'll be prints, fibers." There were, Holmes corrected, "but they're vanishing." He moved to a nearby desk, once a clerk's station, now turned into a meticulous stage. A burned candle, a judge's gavel, a single page of transcript with Redgrave's name marked in bold. Holmes picked it up, scanned the text, and paused. "This transcript differs from the one submitted to the official record," he said softly. "Entire paragraphs replaced with confessions that Redgrave never uttered." Watson frowned. "So Broyle rewrote history in ink?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he flipped the page blank on the back and held it up to the light streaming through a cracked window. Faint watermarking, a maker's seal. This parchment was stolen from the High Court archives. Only one location holds this stock. Lestrade swore under his breath. "You're saying Broyle breached the records department?" "Not just breached," Holmes said, "replaced." Before we could move, a constable burst in. "Sergeant, the evidence vault at Scotland Yard, it's been raided." Lestrade stared. "What?" "Every file on the Moreland case burned, including the original trial notes, the jury statements, the forged transcript. It's all gone." Holmes turned sharply, his jaw tightening. "Then he's severed the link to his crime. He's burying the truth just as fast as we exhume it." We left Redgrave in safe hands and returned at once to the yard, where a crowd had already gathered. Black smoke still curled from the rear. Annex, Lestrade's men moved like ants through ash and ruin. Inside, we found what remained charred fragments, warped drawer handles, and one curious survivor. A single scorched page pinned to the wall with a nail. Holmes approached slowly. It was an excerpt from the treatise on judicial ethics, the same volume Redgrave once owned. One line had been underlined twice in red wax pencil, where justice is impeded by those who speak for it, silence becomes the final appeal. Mockery, Holmes muttered. He's toying with us, removing proof, rewriting guilt. I stepped closer. But why burn the records now? Wouldn't exposing Redgrave be the climax? Because he knows we're close to exposing him instead, Holmes said. Garvey's capture shook him. He's no longer steering the narrative, he's reacting. Desperation has set in. That evening, we reconvened at Baker Street. Holmes laid out the fragments of remaining evidence on the table. A second copy of the falsified transcript. A photo of the Moreland trial jury. The list of those present during the original proceedings. Holmes's fingers hovered over the list. There's someone missing. Missing? I asked. Yes, one of the original jurors, Philip Harrin, a solicitor, age 47 at the time. His name appears in the court record, but not in the photograph. Lestrade frowned. Could be a clerical error. Holmes tapped the list, or something intentional. He sent a telegram to the registry that hour and paced the room until the reply came. When it did, Holmes tore it open with a flash of urgency, then froze. What is it? I asked. He handed me the slip. It read, Philip Harrin, died 1892. Ruled accidental fire. Body unrecovered. Same year Broyle disappeared, Holmes said darkly. No body. A perfect burial. Lestrade narrowed his eyes. You're saying Broyle was Harrin? Holmes nodded. A false identity crafted long before the trial. He orchestrated his own death, slipped from one name to the next. That's how he infiltrated the court. He was part of the Moreland jury, but as Harrin. Then he re-emerged as Broyle, a court transcriber, hidden in plain sight, armed with knowledge of every case, every weakness. And now he's erasing every piece of that path, I said. Holmes turned toward the fireplace and dropped into his chair. He's bleeding the past from the present, every shred of documentation, every voice. That might name him. Soon, even Redgrave's guilt will be unprovable. But not yours, I said. He looked up. You still see it, I continued. Even without records, you see the shape of his plan. Holmes stared into the fire. Yes, Watson, but vision alone is not enough. Not unless I draw him out fully. Then how do we do that? Holmes reached for the burnt slip with the red underlining. We rewrite the ending. One he didn't plan for. He began drafting another message one to be leaked to the press. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder. What are you doing framing a new narrative? Holmes murmured, letting him believe that the final witness, the one person who can connect Harrin to Broyle, still lives. But that's false. It won't be for long, Holmes said. Because tomorrow someone will remember, and Broyle will have no choice but to silence them. And in doing so, he exposes himself. I finished. Holmes smiled faintly, the firelight flickering in his eyes. And that, he said, is where the trap will spring. The morning press carried the headline as Holmes had intended, surviving juror ready to testify, Philip Harren's identity questioned. The article was attributed to an anonymous source and hinted that the missing juror may have faked his death. It was a calculated move, a gamble designed to provoke the man behind the curtain. By midday, Baker Street was unusually quiet. Even the usual creak of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps above seemed muffled, as if the house itself held its breath. Holmes remained seated by the window, watching the street below with a violin across his knees, the bow untouched. The trap was laid, but the silence stretched too long for comfort. Then came the telegram. Holmes caught it as it slipped through the door slot. One glance, and his fingers clenched. He moved faster. "Come to the tower room." "You know why?" G. Holmes stood at once. "Watson, we must go." "Garvey has broken silence." "The forger?" I asked. "He's been silent for days." "Too silent." "He's either ready to talk or someone forced his hand." We arrived at Newgate Prison under storm-streaked skies. The governor, grey-faced and tight-lipped, met us at the gate. "He's dead," he said without preamble. Holmes halted mid-step. "Garvey hanged himself, or so it seems." In the tower room, solitary confinement. We followed in silence, Holmes's mouth drawn into a hard line. The tower room had a narrow slit of a window, a bed, and little else. Garvey lay slumped beneath a crude noose fashioned from torn bedding. Holmes crouched beside the body, ignoring the guards and even Lestrade, who had arrived moments after us. He inspected the knot, the bruising, the tilt of Garvey's shoulders. "Strangled first," he said quietly, "then staged. Rope was added post-mortem." Lestrade exhaled heavily. "Then someone got to him." Holmes rose and moved to the far corner, and they left their signature there, etched into the stone with what looked like the charred stub of a match. Were to words, no echo. It meant something. Holmes's face betrayed that much. His gaze flicked back to the body. We weren't meant to speak to him. He wasn't meant to speak at all. And now we know he never will. Lestrade barked for the prison's full search and records check. But Holmes pulled me aside. "We need to leave. Now." Back at Baker Street, Holmes went straight to his study. He opened his notes on the Moreland case, flipped to the jury photograph, and circled 3 names with urgent strokes. Redgrave, Garvey, and now Marston, another juror? I asked. "Yes, a solicitor's clerk, still active in town." The trap we'd set had failed. But Broylaw, whatever he called himself, was retaliating now. Not by hiding, but by wiping out witnesses before they could speak. It wasn't about silence anymore, it was a purge. We rushed to Marston's lodgings on Clerkenwell Lane. A maid answered, pale and shaking. "He left 2 nights ago," she whispered, said. "Someone was following him. I haven't seen him since." Holmes swept through the flat papers, clothes, receipts all untouched. But on the desk sat a black envelope with Holmes's name inked across the front. He opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It showed Holmes in Regent's Park 2 days prior, unaware he'd been watched. Pinned to it was another scrap of handwriting, Echoes follow the speaker. Silence follows the judge. Holmes said nothing for several seconds. Then he turned to me with a quiet finality. "Marston is already dead." I felt a chill creep into the room. 3 jurors, I said slowly, all silenced before they could link Broyle to the trial. Holmes nodded grimly. He's erasing the chain, one by one. That night, I woke to a noise downstairs, a faint creak too deliberate to be the wind. I reached instinctively for my revolver and moved silently through the hallway. Holmes's door stood ajar, empty. Then I heard a sound to sharp knocks followed. By the shattering of glass, I burst into the sitting room to find Holmes pinned to the floor, grappling with a masked intruder. The figure moved with uncanny precision, but Holmes always quicker broke his grip and delivered a blow to the ribs that sent the man sprawling before I could aim. The attacker smashed through the window and vanished into the night, leaving a trail of blood along the sill. Holmes straightened, chest heaving, his dressing gown torn. "He was here to kill me. Are you hurt?" I asked. He shook his head, then moved to the writing desk. The intruder had left something there, a final message scrawled in red ink. Across Holmes's open notes. "Even you can be silenced. Holmes." Read it, then sat down heavily. "He's ahead. Always one step. He doesn't need a courtroom. His trial unfolds in silence, and his verdict is death." For the first time, I saw something rare flicker behind Holmes's eyes, not fear, but the full weight of mortality. The investigation had changed shape. It was no longer a question of who committed the original crime, but how to stop a man who was turning justice into his own personal stage. And the next victim, unless we acted swiftly, could very well be Sherlock Holmes himself. Holmes sat in silence for nearly an hour after the failed assassination attempt, his gaze fixed on the broken window. He didn't speak, didn't fidgety, simply stared, as if willing the threads of the case to reweave themselves into a shape he could recognize. I cleaned the shallow cut on his forearm without a word, knowing better than to interrupt when he retreated into that focused trance. Finally, he rose. "Watson, we've been playing by his tempo. Let's adjust the rhythm." He pulled open the drawer of his desk and removed the full set of notes, sketches, statements, timelines, even news clippings about the Moreland trial. He spread them across the carpet like puzzle pieces. I moved to help, though most of it I'd seen already. Yet Holmes now handled each fragment as if it had transformed. 3 jurors dead. He muttered, "A barrister murdered in a locked room, and a pattern of threats that escalate with each move we make. He doesn't merely silence, he mirrors." "Mirrors?" I echoed. "Yes," Holmes said, eyes narrowing. "Each victim's fate reflects their role in the trial. Redgrave, the juror who first cast doubt, stabbed with a penknife, the symbol of written dissent. Garvey, the forger, hanged. His sentence had been suspended on appeal. Marston, the clerk, vanished. He handled sealed evidence. He stood, excitement kindling behind his voice. Broyle, or whoever orchestrates this, punishes not just the person, but the nature of their involvement. This is theatre, Watson, executed with legal irony. I followed his pacing. And Moreland himself, what was his role? He was the mouthpiece, a prosecuting barrister with a perfect record until the Harren case. The only case that haunted him. And it was not just the verdict, it was how that verdict came about. Holmes turned to the fireplace mantel, where the old courtroom photograph still rested. He had studied it a dozen times. This time, his attention focused not on the barrister or jurors, but on the back row one man in particular. A man seated in the gallery with his head slightly turned, away from the camera, just enough to conceal his full face. Holmes snatched the magnifying glass and examined the man's hand. "There, Watson, look." I squinted. A ring, not just a ring, a barrister's ring, but worn on the right hand. I blinked. Is that unusual? Unusual enough. It means he wasn't practicing at the time. Likely disbarred or in disgrace, but still close enough to observe. Holmes drew out a second photograph, this one from a newspaper covering an old case he'd once consulted on. He'd placed it beside the courtroom image. The same man, older, grayer, but the same narrow jaw, same rigid posture. The caption read, "Elias Kettridge, former Crown prosecutor, disbarred." Kettridge, Holmes whispered. He lost everything after falsifying evidence in a case a decade ago. Struck off, publicly humiliated. He disappeared from court life, but not from memory, especially not from Morland's. Holmes tapped the photo. It was Morland who exposed him. The Harren trial must have felt like poetic justice. And now, I said slowly, he's orchestrating a counter-prosecution. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Each death, each silencing, it's his twisted rebuttal. A dark inversion of justice. But he never meant to remain invisible. He wanted me to see the pattern, to understand it. That's why he's been watching. At that moment, a faint clicking noise interrupted us. Holmes turned swiftly toward the door. I heard it now, to the faintest tick-tick-tick coming from beneath the floorboards. Holmes crouched at once and pried open the small maintenance hatch. Near the fireplace, taped to a crossbeam, was a small wooden box, its lid etched with the scales of justice. He removed it carefully, opened it. Inside lay a miniature metronome, ticking rhythmically, and beside it, another note. Trial adjourned. But not for long. Holmes studied the mechanism. It's not just a threat, it's a countdown. He's begun the final act. I stared at the ticking device. But why reveal himself now? Because he believes he's already won. Because he thinks I cannot reach him in time. Holmes snapped the lid shut and stood. But he's wrong. He turned back to the notes, scanning rapidly until he found what he wanted. The court records of Kettridge's last known appearance, and more crucially, his listed address at the time of disbarment. "Watson, we're going to Southwark. There's a row of abandoned chambers near Red Cross Street. If he has a lair, that's where it'll be." We reached the address just after nightfall. The chambers were long condemned, their windows boarded and roofs sagging like broken spines. Yet Holmes's lantern revealed something. I hadn't expected chalk markings at the threshold of one particular door. A crude sketch of the crown crossed out. Holmes turned the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, the air was cold and stifled. Dust clung to every surface. But the room was not abandoned. A typewriter sat on the desk. still warm. The walls were lined with court documents, all pinned and connected by red string. Each victim's name, face, and obituary was neatly posted beside the charge Kettridge believed they were guilty of: moral cowardice, negligence, hypocrisy. Holmes moved silently toward the far end of the chamber. There, on a low table, was a transcript of the Moreland trial, not the court's official version, but a rewritten one, marked with annotations in crimson ink, on the final page. Beside Moreland's closing statement were the words: objection, sustained, sentence, death. Holmes turned. This isn't just revenge. It's a retrial. And he's not done. I pointed to a final document tacked near the ceiling. A list. At the top, Moreland, Redgrave, Garvey, Marston, then, chillingly, beneath them, Holmes, Watson, Lestrade. He's expanding the jury, Holmes said grimly. And the next phase won't involve old sins. It will punish those who interfere. Suddenly, the lantern flickered. Footsteps echoed on the stairs behind us. Holmes extinguished the flame. Incoming, he whispered, and I dare say this final act will be performed in person. The footsteps creaked closer, slow and deliberate, too controlled for a vagrant, too steady for a constable. Holmes motioned silently toward a dark alcove behind the ruined desk. We slipped into its shadow just as the chamber door opened with a long groan of rusted hinges. A figure stepped into the room, outlined faintly by the gaslight from the street. Slender, upright, and unmistakably meticulous in movement. He wore gloves despite the heat, and a dark greatcoat buttoned all the way to the throat. He crossed the threshold, paused, and scanned the room. Then, with a motion that betrayed no surprise, he stepped to the desk, lifted the metronome Holmes had replaced, and clicked it back into life. Tick, tick, tick. He sat, drawing from his coat a thick folder bound in twine. The wax seal on its front was shaped like the scales of justice. Holmes leaned slightly forward beside me, breath measured. I know you're here, the man said suddenly, his voice crisp, cultivated, and eerily calm. You followed the rhythm, didn't you, Mr. Holmes? Holmes stepped forward from the shadows, straight-backed and unafraid. You set quite the tempo, Mr. Kettridge. The man turned slowly, in the lamplight. His features were more gaunt than the photograph suggested, hollow cheeks, a mouth set in permanent disappointment, and eyes sharp with a quiet madness. You're older than the legend, Kettridge said with a tilt of the head, but still arrogant enough to think you're the one conducting this. I might not be the conductor, Holmes replied, but I know when a symphony is discordant. You've murdered 5 men and tried for a 6th. Why? To rebalance justice, or to prove it never existed in the first place? Kettridge didn't answer immediately. He stood, walked to the wall, and traced one of the pinned strings connecting the victims. Justice, he murmured, is not a sword or a scale. It's a stage, and like any theater, it demands an audience. Holmes's voice cooled. You lost everything because of a lie you told. Now you wish to punish those who upheld the truth. No, Kettridge snapped, spinning suddenly. Not because they upheld it, because they didn't question it. Because they let it happen. Do you know what it is to stand in the dock not as a criminal, but as the accused in a play directed by incompetence and watched by cowards? His voice rose, not with fury, but a dangerous clarity. Morland destroyed me with the truth, but a selective one. He knew the evidence I falsified was under orders. He knew it would reveal the judge's misconduct if pursued. But he wanted headlines, wanted integrity, so he turned a blind eye to the wider corruption, exposed only my part, and walked away with the applause. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You weren't seeking revenge on Morland for the case. You were exposing the rot in the entire institution. Kettridge gave a faint smile. Precisely. This was never about Morland. He was the opening argument. The rest, the jury, the clerk, the inspector. Even you each represents the blind machinery of justice that turns even when it's off its rails. He crossed to the folder, untied it, and revealed a series of transcripts, letters, memos, unsigned witness accounts. Do you know what these are, Holmes? They're the fragments of all the cases I worked on, the ones where we buried inconvenient truths, silenced witnesses, allowed innocence to suffer because the case was too public to fail. This is the skeleton buried beneath the courtroom's polished floor. He tapped a final sheet. And here's the irony. Most of these men I executed didn't commit murder. They committed apathy. That's the deeper crime. Holmes stared at him for a long, measured moment. So this crusade of yours, these staged punishments, they weren't retribution. They were confession. Kettridge tilted his head. Not mine. I simply gave them the opportunity to feel what it's like to be on trial. I stepped forward then, unable to hold back. And what of us? Are we simply the gallery? Casualties of your soliloquy? He met my eyes, and for the first time, there was something almost like sorrow behind them. I had hoped, he said slowly, that you would understand the purpose by now, especially you. Doctor, you've seen death. You know the difference between justice and consequence. Holmes broke the silence with a low, calm voice. There's a flaw in your logic, Kettridge. You believe justice is dead, so you attempt to resurrect it by imitating the very system you condemn. You've become its most grotesque parody. Kettridge smiled faintly. Even grotesques can tell the truth. Holmes advanced now, his tone tightening. And yet in doing so, you've missed the simplest truth of all. Justice is not delivered through spectacle. It's revealed in restraint. You don't need to kill to prove the law is fallible. You only needed to speak and be ignored. Kettridge said, I did speak. I wrote letters, articles, inquiries. No one cared. But murder, they care about that, don't they? Suddenly, a floorboard creaked above. Lestrade burst in with 2 constables, pistols drawn. Kettridge didn't flinch. He merely closed the folder and set it gently back on the desk. I've already been tried. He murmured, This is only the sentencing, as the constables seized him. He looked once more at Holmes. The next one, he said softly, won't be theatrical. It will be silent, and that's when you will see the truth. They dragged him from the chamber, his coat brushing dust from the walls as he passed. Holmes stood in silence, watching the door swing shut behind him. Then he turned to the desk and lifted the folder once more. "Watson," he said quietly, "we've been following a criminal, but we may have just uncovered a historian of corruption. The only question left is, what do we do with what he's left behind?" And in that dim chamber, with the metronome still ticking, the answer felt far less certain than any case we'd ever solved. The following morning dawned grey and still, the fog lingering low over the Thames like the curtain before a final act. Holmes and I sat in Baker Street, the folder of Kettridge's evidence spread across our table. The documents weighted with pins and annotated with Holmes's precise script. Despite the bareness of the room, the tension was thick as a courtroom. Moments before verdict, Holmes had not spoken in some time, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, gaze fixed on the curling edge of a witness statement dated 10 years past. "I've found it," he said at last. "It's not over." I looked up from my own reading. "Kettridge is in custody. The murders are not the end," Holmes interrupted. Rising with sudden purpose, Kettridge was right about one thing. He was not the only hand in this. There's one more player, hidden, precise, the architect behind Kettridge's descent, perhaps even behind the leaking of his letters. And now, with Kettridge removed from the board, they'll either vanish or strike. I stood. "You think there's another murder coming?" "No," Holmes said, moving quickly to the fireplace. "I think there's one already set in motion. Kettridge's final words, 'The next one won't be theatrical,' suggest planning, a private, untraceable execution. One that won't draw headlines, which means the victim must be someone obscure but important to the narrative." He extracted a letter from his coat pocket, unopened. "This arrived this morning. No return address. Typed. It contains one line. He was the first to question me. He'll be the last to see." He looked at me gravely. "That line, Watson, refers to the court clerk, Mr. Elias Dent, the only man who challenged Kettridge's forged evidence during that fateful trial. Kettridge was silenced before he could name him. Our hidden hand means to finish what Kettridge could not, without another word." We were out the door, carriage bound for Clerkenwell, where Dent had quietly retired. Holmes was more intense then. I had seen him since Moriarty's day, yet eerily calm, every movement deliberate. He carried no weapon, only a leather pouch of powder, his magnifier, and a thin black case he refused to let out of reach. We reached Dent's modest home near dusk. The door was ajar. Holmes didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, and I followed. The smell of smoke and chalk thick in the air. Dent sat in an armchair by the fireplace, unconscious but breathing, and seated across from him was the last man I expected to see, Inspector Braithwaite. Holmes didn't blink. "Ah," he said, "you finally stepped onto the stage." Braithwaite looked up slowly. No panic in his eyes, only something harder resignation. "He should have died quietly," he said. "You always ruin the neat endings." Holmes stepped forward. "You gave Kettridge the information, fed him the files, the witness records. Let him believe he was serving justice when he was serving your design." "Why?" Braithwaite smiled faintly. "Because justice needed a reckoning. You think I enjoyed watching innocent men jailed while the powerful walked free? You think I didn't. Try to correct it from the inside. You manipulated Kettridge, Holmes said coldly. Used his fragile pride and his ruin to wage a war you didn't have the courage to fight yourself. I gave him purpose. Braithwaite's voice cracked. He was a discarded man. I gave him clarity. And now, I asked, was Dent your loose end? Braithwaite stood slowly. Dent remembered too much. Knew that Kettridge wasn't working alone. I never meant to kill him, just ensure his silence. A drugged brandy, a quiet heart attack. But you arrive and sully everything. Holmes said nothing. He stepped closer, that black case still in his hand. You killed with ideas, Braithwaite, not with knives or poison, but with the illusion of purpose. You made Kettridge believe he was saving justice by dismantling it. Braithwaite's face hardened. You can't arrest me. You have no proof. I don't need proof, Holmes replied. I only need patience. He turned to Dent, still breathing, and uncorked a small vial of ammonia from the pouch. Within moments, the old clerk gasped awake, eyes wide and panicked. It's all right, Holmes said gently. You're safe, and you're not alone. Braithwaite backed toward the door, hand twitching toward his coat. I wouldn't, Holmes warned, from the shadows of the hallway. Lestrade stepped into view, revolver raised. Good evening, Inspector, he said flatly. We've been listening for the past 5 minutes. Braithwaite stiffened, eyes narrowing. You set this up? Holmes merely nodded. Every word you said has been recorded, and Dent will testify to your presence here and your intent. The net closes. Braithwaite. You can either walk into it or swing from it. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then Braithwaite laughed low, bitter and hollow. You're wrong, Holmes, he said. Justice was never meant to be fair, only final. And with that, he reached inside his coat, not for a weapon, but a small silver whistle. He blew it once, sharp and shrill. A second later, a carriage outside bolted into motion, but not fast enough. Holmes had anticipated the move. A second unit of constables intercepted it halfway down the street. Braithwaite slumped into the chair opposite Dent, defeated as Lestrade cuffed him. Holmes finally opened the black case. Inside was a single page from Kettridge's folder, the only copy linking Braithwaite to the files. He held it to the fire. Why? I asked. Because the story is over, Holmes said quietly, and some truths do more harm than good. Braithwaite watched the flames consume the page. His voice was little more than a whisper. You're no different than me. Holmes looked at him then, with a stillness that silenced the room. No, he said. That's the difference. Outside, the fog had begun to lift the embers in. The fireplace had cooled to grey ash by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that evening. Outside, the city was winding down, oblivious to the quiet collapse of yet another man who had tried to play puppeteer with justice. Braithwaite had been taken into custody. Dent was resting under supervision, and Lestrade at long last had allowed himself a rare nod of admiration toward Holmes. Before taking his leave, I poured 2 cups of tea in silence. Holmes accepted, his without comment, his gaze drifting toward the corner of the room where Kettridge's case file had been retired to a locked drawer. "It's done," I offered gently. "The last string has been cut." Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes had narrowed slightly, not in satisfaction, but in calculation. "No, Watson," he murmured. "Not cut, frayed." Before I could reply, there came a knock at the door, 3 precise raps, evenly spaced. Holmes stood and opened it himself. A boy stood there, one of Wiggins's older lads, out of breath and red-cheeked. "This came just now, sir," he said, handing over a sealed envelope. Holmes took it, gave the lad a coin, and closed the door. He opened the envelope without sitting, scanned the contents, then reread them, slower. "What is it?" I asked, setting down my cup. He held out the letter. The handwriting was unfamiliar, scrawled in a nervous, slanted hand. "You looked at the right man, but in the wrong way. He was the weapon, not the hand. She watched you unravel everything, and now she knows how you think. Be careful, Mr. Holmes. She's not done." There was no signature. Holmes exhaled slowly, then turned toward the fireplace, tapping the letter against his palm. "She," I said. "You don't think, I think," Holmes said, "that Braithwaite was not the architect. He was merely the tool." I stood, pacing. "But he confessed. He tried to murder Dent. He orchestrated Kettridge's access to the case files." "Yes," Holmes interrupted, "but all of it had one common trait: execution without authorship. Braithwaite acted, but he was always reacting, pushed by something or someone cleverer. Someone who understood human pressure points better than even he did." He walked to the drawer, unlocked it, and removed the Kettridge file again. "Do you recall the anonymous tip that led Kettridge to reopen his first false case? It came from a retired schoolmistress named Never Verified. The call that lured the clerk out of archives the night those files were switched. A woman's voice, never identified. And even Braithwaite, in his moments of loose-lipped indignation, never once claimed the planning as his own. He was too meticulous to leave that unclaimed unless he couldn't. "But who?" I asked, feeling the unease creep in. Holmes paused, scanning the report from the theatre's original cast and crew long dismissed as irrelevant. His finger stopped at a name I barely recalled. Clara Ilwell, set designer. Dismissed after Kettridge's last play for professional differences. She never appeared in police records, Holmes said, voice low. But she had access to the scripts, knew Kettridge's symbols and habits, and designed the very motifs Braithwaite would later claim Kettridge devised alone. He moved to the index of Braithwaite's meetings, and here he met with the CE 3 times in the months before Kettridge's arrest. The initials were too vague to trace until now. A silence followed. Then Holmes straightened and looked at me. "She wrote this letter," he said simply, "warning us, perhaps taunting. She knows she's invisible for now." "But why?" I asked. "What's her motive?" Holmes returned to the window, eyes scanning the fog. "That," he said, "is the final mystery. Perhaps vengeance, perhaps ideology. Perhaps something personal between her and Kettridge. But whatever it is, She orchestrated this from the wings. I thought of the theatre, of the masks and shadows, and the silent hands moving scenery behind the stage. She used them all like actors, I muttered. Holmes nodded. And the final act has not yet begun. A chill ran through me, not from the cold, but from the sudden understanding that we had not solved a crime, but merely removed a decoy. The real game was still hidden behind the curtain, and the director had not yet taken her bow. I must find her, Holmes said, almost to himself, before she decides the next role I must play. And in the soft crackle of the fireplace, I couldn't help but feel we were being watched. The wind had shifted by morning. A sharp, unsettled current whistled between the chimneys of Baker Street, as if London itself sensed the balance had tilted and refused to calm. Holmes had not slept. I found him precisely where I'd left him hours earlier, seated at the desk, eyes fixed on a network of documents pinned in precise alignment across the wall. Red thread-mapped connections no one else could have imagined, and in the center, pinned by a single brass tack, was the name, Clara Ilwell. She hasn't disappeared. Holmes murmured, before I could speak. She simply stepped behind the curtain again. What now? I asked, not bothering to hide the fatigue in my voice. Do we hand it over to Lestrade? Issue a warrant? Holmes shook his head. Lestrade will demand evidence she's unlikely to leave behind. No, Watson, this requires something more elegant. He stood abruptly and crossed to the fireplace. From behind a loose brick one I hadn't noticed before, he withdrew a small black ledger. With care, he opened it to a marked page and traced a finger down a column of names. Ilwell once worked under an assumed name during a brief contract at the Royal Victoria Theatre. He said she designed a production of The Silent Crown, a piece lauded for its brilliant minimalism. What no one noticed was that its set contained a ciphered calendar, a rotating backdrop that shifted subtly each night to mirror real-time dates. She encoded time by said. Indeed, Holmes said. That production closed on May 4th, Kettridge's last successful premiere. Her departure coincided with the collapse of a promising design career. I suspect she blamed Kettridge for that fall, though it likely stemmed from a producer's grudge. But Clara, she would never settle for a personal vendetta. She elevated it. He moved to a stack of letters, collected from Braithwaite's office, harmless-looking notes in calligraphy, all unsigned. Look closer, Holmes said, passing me one. Every capital letter in the third paragraph, rearranged. They spell set the trap slowly. It's her touch, a theatrical motif wrapped in codes. But we didn't catch it, I muttered. No, Holmes said, because she didn't want us to until now. A knock interrupted us. Lestrade entered, coat wet from rain, expression grim. We've got trouble, he said without greeting. Braithwaite's dead. Suicide if you believe what the guard says. Holmes's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Cut his wrist with a wire, smuggled into his cell inside a book. Pages were blank except for a note tucked behind the back cover. One line. Lestrade pulled out a small evidence bag and handed it to Holmes. I leaned in to read. Every man believes he's the author of his own ending, but the script is always mine. No signature. but no doubt either. She knew he'd break. Holmes said quietly, "She planned it. She'll vanish now," Lestrade muttered. "Even if we could find her, what would we charge her with? There's nothing, no prints, no direct link to the murder weapon, no ledger trails." Holmes's gaze was far away. "She will not vanish. She'll reinvent herself. Her satisfaction depends on witnessing her work. Like any true dramatist, she must hear the applause, even if it's silent." That afternoon, Holmes and I returned to the Royal Victoria Theatre. There, in the archives, behind a false wall in the costume wing, Holmes uncovered the final proof, an unperformed script, handwritten, titled The Barrister's Reflection. It mirrored Kettridge's own life in unnerving detail. A man who builds a career by destroying others, only to be undone by the echo of his own lies. The final stage direction read, "He exits, unseen by all, as the light fades on an empty stage." We brought the script to Lestrade. It was enough to confirm Holmes's theory, if not enough to satisfy the courts. Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the map of red-threaded connections one last time. Then, with deliberate care, he cut the thread from Braithwaite's name and left Clara's untouched. "Will she strike again?" I asked. "I believe she already has," Holmes said. "Somewhere in the wings of another man's downfall. She won't act for money, nor out of simple revenge. She selects men like Kettridge, proud, cruel, self-convinced, and writes their tragedy before they know they're part of it. And we fail to stop her." "No," Holmes said. "We revealed her. That was her flaw. She believed herself invisible. But no true artist can resist recognition forever. She'll make a mistake. When she does, I'll be waiting." As I turned to leave the room, my eyes caught on a small envelope resting on the sill. No stamp, no name. Holmes opened it, unfolded the single slip inside. His eyes narrowed. "I do hope the theatre wasn't too dusty. The next performance will be even more intimate." And below, in a tiny, looping script, "Clara." The fire hissed softly behind us. Outside, the fog thickened. But inside, Holmes stood still, unblinking, already composing the next act. Justice had been touched, yes, but not captured, and somewhere Clara Ilwell was watching. The fog had thickened into a pale shroud by the time Holmes and I left Baker Street that evening. Though the case had, in official terms, reached its conclusion, Kettridge dead, Braithwaite exposed, and Clara Ilwell vanished into the ether, there was no real sense of closure. Holmes had said little since reading her final note. That alone told me something still troubled him. We walked along the Thames in silence. Gas lamps flickered like distant eyes in the gloom. Holmes's collar was turned up against the cold, but his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "You've been quiet," I said. He gave a faint nod. "Because something still grates. Watson, Clara's escape. No. That was inevitable the moment we underestimated her. No, it's something else, a minor inconsistency, perhaps, but it will not leave me." We stopped near the Victoria Embankment. Holmes drew a small notebook from his pocket and opened to a dog-eared page. "Do you recall the letter she left? For Braithwaite, the line about authorship of one's own ending. Yes. What of it? She used that phrasing before in a review she ghostwrote for a play that closed within a week. A piece no one saw save for a few critics and the director. The director later went bankrupt under mysterious circumstances. Holmes tapped the notebook. It's the reuse of that line that bothers me. Clara is many things, but redundant. She is not. I frowned. You think it was deliberate? I think it was staged, Holmes said. The note to Braithwaite was meant to confirm her presence. Yes, but what if it was also misdirection? What if she wanted us to believe she wrote it? Because the real author of that message of that script was someone else? My mind reeled at the possibility. Then she's not acting alone. She never was. Holmes said she was the playwright, but not the producer. Someone else finances these tragedies, chooses the players, manipulates from behind the curtain. And the clue is in her own repetition. Precisely, repetition is rare in art, but common in partnership, particularly in coded collaboration. I believe we've only seen the first act of a much larger performance. We returned to Baker Street at once. Holmes went directly to the archive and retrieved the old review he had referenced. It was unsigned, buried in a back page of Theatrical Gazette, detailing a failed production titled The Hollow Gavel. The plot, chillingly familiar, revolved around a corrupt magistrate who is framed by a woman wronged by his past rulings. The climax, the magistrate's suicide imprisoned by a hidden blade in a book. I thought Clara's plan was original. I said, "It was an echo," Holmes replied, fingers tightening on the paper. She's refining someone else's work, building towards something larger. And Watson looked at the typeset signature. At the bottom of the article was a faint monogram, invisible at first glance, 3 interlocking letters E, L, and veal well, I suspect so. Holmes said, or someone using her name as part of a larger symbol. A theatrical troupe, a society, perhaps even a cult of narrative justice. A knock at the door broke the tension. Mrs. Hudson handed Holmes a sealed envelope. No address. No sender. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a single card, gold lettering, ornate. Your attendance is requested at the premiere of The Fall of The Sleuth. 1 night only, curtain at midnight, and below, in that familiar, looping hand. Let's see who writes the final line. There was no signature. None was needed. Holmes folded the card and placed it in the fireplace. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges into ash. She's baiting you, I said. She's inviting me. Holmes corrected. And will you go? Of course. His voice was steady. But not tonight. Tonight, we rest. The next act is still being written. The embers flickered low, outside. The fog seemed thicker than before, wrapping the city in its cold breath. Holmes leaned back in his chair, violin resting across his knee, bow hovering above the strings. There's always one more twist, isn't there? I said. Holmes plucked a soft, haunting note. Always, Watson. That is the curse and the charm of a good mystery. And, as the final note faded into silence, I knew deeply and irrevocably that this was not the end, only an intermission.